Hello, I'm Giorgio Baldini, and I will be showing you how to draw a realistic dog using colored pencils. Here are the materials that I've chosen to use. All of these are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. You will need kneaded eraser, sharpener, and wash paint tape, and you should be good to go. So I'm first starting off with just creating a basic sketch with the background. I find that doing the background first helps a lot, make the piece stand out a lot. And by the way, for my sketch, basically what I did was I used some red tracing paper that printed onto my my final piece, onto my expensive paper, so then that way I'm not wasting my expensive paper. So I'm going in with my lightest colors, making sure to establish the highlights and leave those white, and then also go in with the shadows. That's really important that you establish your shadows when you're drawing. You want your drawing to have a lot of contrast. So as you can see, I'm working from light to dark, trying to follow the reference very closely, and by the end of this tutorial, you'll see what the dog looks like. So I'm just adding more colors. This is the mirror I'm doing in the background. And then I'm making sure to keep the reflection in the mirror pretty light, because that's where most of the light is showing through. Also going in with my black, darkest pencil to get in more of the areas. I'm getting the shadows underneath his chest and around his arms. Also getting the carpet and pillows around him, because it looks like he's on a couch. And then just adding more details. You want to start off with your base coat fairly light, fairly even, and I recommend keeping your pencils very sharp. This helps avoid graininess and bluntness to your paper. And then when you've gotten all your base coats accurately mapped out, you want to go in with more finer detailed pencils, add the highlights and shadows by enhancing them. As you can tell right now, what I'm doing is I'm taking my black and white pencil and making the contrast higher. And if you don't know what contrast is, it relates to the values, and values are how light or dark a color is. So I'm trying to make it pop by using values. Also, I'm using a burnishing technique with my white pencil, smoothing it out, and this gives it a really nice look, as you can tell. I'm also taking the cream and going over the areas. I'm adding black, but when you add black, you want to make sure that it's not your last coat, because black can make the drawing look dull and flat. However, I don't think there's a problem with using black, because and then I'm just burnishing out the background with my white pencil, as you can tell. Making sure to keep everything fairly light in these stages, because if you go out too dark, you might have a hard time correcting something. Just burnishing. And if you don't know what burnishing is, it's basically applying a lot of pressure to the paper with your pencil to smoothen it out, to get a very smooth look, so that your drawing doesn't appear flat. and with this, you can either use a white pencil like I did, or you can use a colorless blender. Either way work. With highlights, I would recommend using a white pencil. If you're doing midtones and shadows, then definitely use a colorless blender. And if you're burnishing out black, it is very important to make sure that you add the color, the natural color over that, over the top of it, so it doesn't look dull and flat, like I just said. Now I'm going in with the eyes. All I'm mapping them out is with a black pencil, because I need to make sure I get in all the shadows and highlights. Preserve the highlights and darken my shadows. That's very important, but keep the shadows fairly light when you're just going in, because if you make a mistake, it could be really hard to correct it if you go in too dark with your black pencil. It is very, 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 very important that you pay attention to how your eyes are on your animal. As you might have heard, the eye can make or break your piece. You can see how I did my eyes. You need to spend the most time of your portrait just on the eyes. Because the eyes are like the gateway to your piece. They're like the gateway to the animal. They show the inside of it, the true self. It is really important that you get them correct. And start with preserving the darkest and lightest areas, and then gradually go over with your mid-tones. And by the way, I'm adding cream around the eye because I want that to be my undertone to the fur. Even though the fur is not really cream, it's like a blackish brown color. I'm adding cream and then burnt ochre over that, because later you'll see I'm going to scrape over using an X-Acto knife to preserve some of the highlights, which is another really key feature that I use. So I'm just making more of the eyes darker, trying to get in all the little details. At this point, actually, you don't really want to get in all. Now, once I've gotten the eyes in, as you can see, I'm just going back over them for the detail. You're going to want to work on the nose and the snout. So you should always try to, while in art many may argue that there's not many rules, there's no one way that you need to do this. I highly recommend beginning with the eyes, because the eyes are the most important piece of the drawing, and then slowly moving to the nose and the mouth, and then do what's below the head. So always start off with the head first, and then the rest of the body after. And this is after you've done the background, because I always start with the background first. And I'm just adding more hairs around the eye to give it more finish, to give it a more realistic look. And it is really important that you make your hairs and fur go in the direction that they're actually going in, rather than just straight lines. As you can see, my lines are more wavy rather than just straight, uniform line, because in reality, you're not going to have straight, uniform lines as your hair. It actually looks much more realistic if you make it more out of order and less uniform, because in real life, people are not going to have perfect, and dogs are not going to have perfect fur, as you can tell. They're going to have, every once in a while, there's going to be a little flyaway hair, and you want to include those and incorporate those in your drawing. Just intensifying it with my black pencil. Blacks are great ways to darken up your shadows, and so are browns and dark blues. I'm also darkening up the eyes. I notice that the values are a little off. I need to make sure that they match the reference. It is so important that you focus and pay attention to your reference. And a good reference can really make your piece, and a bad reference can really break your piece. Because this style of art focuses on hyporealism and making the piece as realistic and as lifelike lifelike as possible. So you really want to make sure you have it accurate and mapped out correctly. So now what I'm doing is I'm adding some of a blue on top of this, because the blue enhances the vibrancy of the color of the black, so it doesn't look just dull and flat. I'm also using a colorless blender to blend this out. And I'm still not super concerned about adding detail at this stage yet, because we're going to go over with an X-Acto knife and more white pencils. Now that I've finished this, now that I've finished the upper half, I'm going to begin the nose in the snout. I start off with a base layer of cream, which is my lightest value, and then I go over with some burnt ochre to add more of a mid-tone. And you always want to work light to dark. In colored pencils, I find it easy to work light to dark because it's a drier medium. And with dry mediums, generally you work light to dark. It's not like an oil paint or acrylic where you would, where you can go over really easily with a paint, like a white paint. Colored pencil is much harder to correct your errors if you go in way too dark. So you want to make sure that you keep everything pretty light. But I'm not saying that you don't want to keep everything super light in your final piece. You just want to keep your first layers light and then gradually get darker and darker and darker. So I've added in the nose now. Just going over some black, making sure to keep the hairs nice, close to the reference as possible. I'm adding blue over because blue really enhances the vibrancy. It makes it look more 3D and realistic. Also adding some highlights over. Going over some burnt ochre. And it's really important that you make sure that it looks like it's one piece and not two pieces of hair, because right now it looks like it's two pieces, and you might be confused why it looks like that. At this stage, it's okay if it looks like two pieces, but you really want to make it look like one piece as you get further into the drawing, because in reality, you're not going to have a dog that has, or sometimes you will, I mean, it's pretty rare, but in reality, most of the time, you're not going to have a dog that has a brown snout and then black, like a black forehead. So now I'm making it more realistic by going over with the black. But you do not want to overdo this, because if you overdo it, it'll make your drawing look flat and 2D instead of 3-dimensional. I noticed that there's somewhat of a blue undertone on the left side of the snout, so I'm going in with some blue. And I believe I used the medium phthalo blue for that. And I also use some white over that to burnish it out. Now I'm starting on the ears. So again, I start with my lightest color, which in this case, it was either yellow ochre or cream. And then I'm going over with some raw umber, which is a medium tone brown. And then I'm going over some burnt umber, or walnut brown, which is a darker version for this. Next thing, I'm gonna add some black over, as you can tell. And then to finish it off, I noticed that there's kind of a greenish tinge to it. I also went in a little bit over with a tiny bit of green, just to give it a natural look because of the lighting. It's not really actually green, it's just a lighting reflection on it. So I'm just building the ears up in layers, making sure to follow the direction of which, where the tiny individual hairs go. Because this is really important at the end when you're going to add all your fine details. You want to make sure it looks very 3D and lifelike rather than just 2D and flat. Just adding some more black in. And then I'm also adding a little bit of blue too, because it has kind of a bluish undertone. Adding white to the side because you can't really, there's not like a defined area where the fur stops. It just kind of fades into the background. Now I'm starting with the collar. So the collar's red. In the reference, I'm just adding some darker reds over it and some black and some brown, and then going back over the top of the black with the red so it doesn't look dull in 3D. Adding white for highlights. Now I'm adding some black and burnt umber for the shadows. Underneath his snout is very dark, as you can tell. So you really want to make sure to go, this is the time where you're going to go really deep with your black. It's really important that you go really dark with your black. And try not to add a ton of colors that are not dark underneath it, because your paper can only handle, the tooth of your paper, depending on how smooth it is, can only handle so much pencil to it. I'm just using the Bristol, I'm using the Strathmore mixed media paper. I actually recommend using the Bristol vellum for this, but since I'm doing this on a 6x8 portrait, I have to use just the regular Strathmore, I believe it's 400 or 500 series mixed media paper. It's white, but you can also get tone too. I like tone for some things too. So you can see how I'm adding, making sure to adding in my really dark, dark shadows and undertones while making sure to keep the highlights very bright and white. You don't have to use all the same exact supplies that I did in this tutorial, but what matters more is that you understand the concepts that I'm going through and the techniques rather than the actual supplies itself. Many may think that you have to have the most expensive colored pencils to achieve this, and while that can really help, it's not always true. A good artist doesn't always have to have the finest pencils. And I'm just finally finishing this out and wait to see the finished product. So this is the final result. And thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe.